What I thought was going to be just a couple of videos about Grafana has turned into somewhat of a mini-series. So today I'm going to show you another interesting thing I'm doing with Grafana to show how much time is being spent for each streaming app on each of my Rokus in the house. And I'm going to use the discrete visualization that I showed you in the last video to do this. So let's get to the computer. Okay, so we start, first things first, I will assume that you've had installed InfluxDB and Grafana. I have a video or two in the past on that, so make sure that's done. And then the next thing you need to do is make sure that you have your Roku integration set up if you're going to use the Roku. So we'll come down here and I'll show you that. So down here to configuration, over to integrations, and I have 3 of them already set up. But Roku's integration is a specific integration where you add them one by one. So if you have additional Rokus or you have a Roku, you do add the integration and then you type in the host name 192.168.1. whatever it is, and then you submit, and then it will show up on this integrations card. So once you have that done and you have all your hosts set up or all your Roku set up, then the next step to do is come over to Node-RED, and we're going to build a couple of paths on this flow to take the data from the Roku, the state, and then rewrite it into an InfluxDB measurement. So the first thing we're going to need is we're going to need a state node, and we'll configure the state node with the name of, I'm going to use my living room Roku, and then we'll use an entity ID of media player. And when you add those Rokus through the integration, they should show up as media player. You'll have to go check and make sure that's correct. Once they do show up, then you can pull them from this list here. So I'm going to do media player living room Roku Ultra, that one right there. And then I also don't want to do anything on this particular path if the Roku isn't idle. I don't want anything changing. So I'm going to set it to is not idle. So that means that it won't be true if it's, or it won't send anything through if it's idle. I like to do output on connect just to have it, if you do a restart or something, I want to have it show me what the state is and mark a timestamp in the database for that state. All right, that one's done. All right, so next up we're going to need a function node. So I'm going to search for it with the right spelling. I'm going to search for it. There you go. Function node's going to come on over here. And the function node's purpose is to take the value or the value of the state, the new state, from the state node and output it to the InfluxDB out node. And the way we do that is we go here and we set a message block, and we're going to call it payload, or we're going to tell it the payload is going to be the message from the previous node, data new, or data.newState. And the reason we're saying new state is the state node that we're going to get this from has a new state and an old state returned for these Rokus. And so I want to make sure that I'm pulling the new state, not the old state. So we specify new state, and we're getting an attribute from the node, and that attribute's called app name. So the payload will be message, the message from the previous state node, the data object, the new state from that data object, the attributes from that object, and the app name. There's also one called source, which I think looks exactly the same. So you can either use source or app name. I haven't used source, app name works for me, but it looks like they're the same. So your choice there. And then that's it. If you click off of this line, you shouldn't get any errors here. So once you write this up, if you don't have any red X's on here, once you take focus away, you should be good to go. So we're done there, except I want to go back and name it. So let me just call it living room, just to keep things organized well. All right, so now we're going to go from here. If the state is true, we're going to go to the living room ultra, or the living room function. And now what we want to do is we want to take the value that the function is going to output and put that in as a measurement to InfluxDB. Again, I'm using InfluxDB. If you're using a different database, this might be different for you, but for Influx, this is how I do it. And so we'll look for InfluxDB out. So I'm taking the output of this and essentially outputting it to InfluxDB. So we'll configure this now. I'll go name first this time, living room Roku. And then the measurement, we can create whatever we want as a measurement here. It's a value that gets stored in the Influx database as a measurement at the time that the event occurs. So when it changes state, it's going to put a blip, I call it a blip, it's going to put an input in the database at the time the measurement occurred or the measurement state change occurred. So I'm going to send a measurement of living room Roku, just to make it simple. And so anytime the state changes on that Roku, it's going to say living room Roku did this or this state. So it's going to put an object at this particular time in the Influx database, and we're done with that. So I'll tie that to this one. And now what we have is a path that goes from the living room Roku state to the living room function, which rewrites it as an output to the InfluxDB, and we'll deploy it. And you can see right here it says idle. That just basically means that the Roku right now is in idle. And I mentioned earlier why I use idle, and I probably forgot a point. One of the points is when it's idle, it doesn't return an object to the function. The object is different. So it doesn't have the new state attributes, all of that stuff. And so I'd prefer not to have a bunch of errors show up in my debug log because it's sitting at idle, so I just don't pass it through when it's idle. All right, so that's the living room Roku. If I want to just do this for another Roku, and I have 3 of them, right? So I'm going to highlight all of that, Control C, 3 nodes have been copied, and I'm going to Control V that to paste it. And everything else is the same except the names and the entity ID. So pretty much nothing's the same. I'm just going to change this to Playroom. And then for this, I'm going to remove that part and say Playroom Roku. All the rest of it remains the same on this node. This is basically just a name change on this one. And then I'm going to change this measurement, or the name as well as the measurement. So this is Playroom Roku. We'll make this Playroom Roku. And we will save this as well. And by the way, I didn't mention, but the server is your InfluxDB server on the out node. Again, watch some of my other videos that talk about how to set that up. So if you need help with that. All right, so now we have Playroom Roku going to the Playroom function, going to the Playroom Roku measurement in InfluxDB. There may or may not be a way to combine these functions. They do exactly the same thing, they just have a different measurement. There might be a way to do a switch node or something in here to say which particular device it's coming from and combine the function so you don't have a bunch of function nodes that do exactly the same thing with a different name. But I'm not gonna mess with that today. This is a simple version. All right, so I have 2 Rokus configured for 2 measurements going to Influx. Now I've been running this for a couple of days, so I have data in my Grafana database. So now what I'll do is I'll show you how to configure Grafana to display the data from the database. All right, so I'm over here in Grafana and I'm using a playground dashboard that I created. And I will add a panel to that. So a new panel. And I'm going to add the discrete visualization to that. So we'll click on discrete. Discrete's not default. Discrete I've added as an additional plugin to Grafana through the Grafana configuration in Home Assistant. Video on that for this one, so check that one out if you need help with that. So discrete is what I'll be using here, and I will be using I will be modifying this query right here. Let me smush this up a little bit so we can see better. All right, remember how I talked about using a measurement. This is not where in some of the other Grafana graphs we use entity IDs in the where clause, but for this we're just using simply a measurement. If you just added this to Node-RED and you haven't done anything in your Rokus, there won't be any measurements in there. You need to go into your Roku, mess around with it, switch through apps and different things so you get some measurements. Otherwise, they won't show up as an option here. Again, I've been running this for a couple days, so I have these options available to me, or the measurements available. So living room Roku I know is there, so I'll select that. So I want to remove this, and I want to add a different type of value here, and it's going to be a last selector. So I want the last value that was input into the database to show up as part of this graph. And it does it over time, right? So choose that. My fill is going to be none. So then I don't have anything going on in between the different apps that are being shown. And let me just give it a name. I'll just leave it at that. And then the panel title, I'll change up here at the top to living room. Now, one thing you'll notice here, if I hover over that section, that says Roku. And what that is that is the default app that is the Roku like home screen. And it sits on that whenever there's nothing going, at least for this particular Roku. The Ultra has that default fish tank screensaver that stays up all the time, even when it's not displaying anything or the TV's turned off. And I believe that's what the Roku app is. I don't want to see that on my timeline as a big orange thing. So what I can do for that is come down here and I can change the color mappings. And these are case sensitive. So if you look here, it says Roku with a capital R. I can change ROKU to some color, and I'm gonna, you can use the selector here, but I know that hex code 000000 is black. So now you'll notice right away when I make that change that all of these spaces in here where it just says Roku is now black. So all I see highlighted are the areas where something actually happened. And let me make this last 24 hours so it's easier to see. So Disney, Netflix, YouTube, and Sling. So one of the other things that you can choose down here, or one of the many other things, is you can choose the amount of time that these particular apps have streamed or been showing on the screen. This is a percentage, and I would prefer, rather than having a percentage, I would prefer to have a period of time. So you can change that here by coming down and selecting show time and removing show percent. So there you go. I can see the time. One of the other things, let me see if it's available on this. Yes. So the text size is pretty huge for me, so I want to make that a little bit smaller. So there we go. At least now it's not this massive thing that overruns the whole screen or the whole chart there. All right, so that is me adding the living room Roku, and I can apply that. It takes me back to the dashboard screen, and I can stretch this out full width and kind of shrink it up. If you can see that, kind of shrink it up so it just fits right below the legend here. I'm going to save that. And now I've got one. I think it's possible to put multiple things on the same, multiple queries on the same discrete panel, but I've noticed funny things happen. It doesn't display quite right. So it's okay for me to add an additional couple of graphs or a couple of visualizations for each Roku separately rather than combine them all to one. So for that, I can do a copy, and then I can do a, up here, I can do a paste copied panel, and I'll leave the living room one up here, and then I will change this one to a different, or the other Roku. We'll call this one Playroom Roku. Pretty much everything else stays the same. When you copy, all you need to do is change the query, and if you have any titles, and make sure you change those in both the alias or the legend, and then also in the title of the panel. And that's all changed. And all of the settings you had for color mappings and size of font, legend, metrics, and all this stuff down here will all stay the same since the copied panel. I'll apply it, and then I will save it. And now you'll see that the Playroom Roku is pretty idle. And now I can even compare the two if I wanted to. All right, one of the things I'll choose here too is, let's go last 2 days. And I'll just give it a little bit more activity. You can see where everything shows up here. So that is an interesting visualization that I use for my purposes, right? It just goes to show you there's a lot of stuff you can do within Grafana to take your Home Assistant values and plot them across the screen. I hope you enjoyed that video. If you did, make sure you hit that thumbs up button. If you didn't, hit the thumbs down. That's good too. Make sure you like and subscribe. And if you have any comments, throw those down below. I'm always up for new content suggestions and comments on my videos, and I try to respond to most of them as much as I can. And that's it. We'll see you on the next video.